Two anniversaries, neither of them politically easy for the government. The past week's been dominated by a bitter divide over how to mark the October 7 Hamas attack on Israel. Tomorrow marks 12 months since the Voice referendum. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. The government hasn't planned much to mark the anniversary of the Voice referendum. It won't want to dwell on the defeat 12 months ago. But the way forward for Indigenous recognition remains very unclear. The two sides of politics remain deeply divided on this, just as they were in marking the anniversary of the October 7 attack on Israel. The major parties couldn't reach agreement on a motion in Parliament. The Prime Minister's call for a ceasefire in the Middle East rejected by the opposition, which is staunchly backing Israel's actions in pursuing its enemies.
Tensions high on the one-year anniversary.
What was meant to be a bipartisan moment to mark the anniversary of October 7 turned sour.
The Prime Minister and opposition leader unable to find common ground.
Every innocent life matters. Every Israeli, every Palestinian, every Lebanese.
The Prime Minister is trying to speak out of both sides of his mouth.
Our government has consistently and repeatedly called for a ceasefire.
Now is not the time.
The Palestinian people and the Lebanese people are not my enemy.
We can't have a ceasefire at the moment that would allow terrorist organisations to regroup and reform and continue to attack innocent civilians.
I support Israel's right to defend itself.
In what world do you think blowing up 20,000 children is self-defence?
We have said that there needs to be a de-escalation.
Will you sanction Israel for its illegal actions and occupation?
You think the end point of politics is to hold up a sign?
This should be a day of unity. This should not be a day for petty politics.
Division required, ring the bell. The matter was resolved in the affirmative.
Good morning. These are incredibly serious allegations.
The opposition once again pursued the issue of Palestinian visas.
Has the visa of this individual been cancelled?
If at any point our security agencies gave advice to the government that a visa should be cancelled, then the government, of course, would take seriously that advice.
Why has he remained in Australia despite these very grave associations?
Does this show the visa process was rushed?
No. I have confidence in ASIO's system.
The Middle East remains on edge for a potential escalation.
Israel has carried out what appears to be its deadliest attack yet on central Beirut.
This is an example of what happened and is happening every night in the southern suburb.
We continue to operate against the enemy.
To the enemy we say, you have only seen a little.
This was just the beginning. We must do everything to avoid an all-out war in Lebanon.
My guest this morning is the Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson. First, let's check what's making news. Another UN peacekeeper has been wounded in southern Lebanon, the fifth to be injured in recent days. Israel's been criticised for two earlier strikes that wounded 4 peacekeepers, but the UN says it doesn't know the origin of this latest attack. US President Joe Biden is urging Israel to stop firing on UN peacekeepers in Lebanon. In the 9 newspapers, Shane Wright reports a $25 billion hole has been blown in the budget since 2019 due to a collapse in tobacco excise. It's prompted calls for the government to reverse years of ever-increasing taxes on cigarettes as more smokers are buying from the black market. And finally, we're into the final fortnight of the Queensland election campaign and the Sunday Mail splashes with free lunch. Premier Stephen Miles is promising a free healthy lunch for every child at a public primary school if Labor wins. The polls currently show that's unlikely to happen. We're going to start this morning on the Middle East and the partisan divide here that's only grown over the past 12 months. It is rare to see the two major parties unable to reach agreement on a simple motion to mark an anniversary. It was also, however, unsurprising. The government continues to call for a ceasefire and de-escalation. The opposition says it's the wrong time for that. The idea of bipartisanship on foreign policy increasingly feels like it belongs to a different era. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Mark Kenny, James Massola and Carly Williams. Good to see you all. Let's just start, Mark, on the latest in the Middle East. There have been more attacks in Gaza, more Israeli strikes in Gaza over the last 24 hours. But it's these attacks in Lebanon that have seen some UN peacekeepers wounded that's causing a lot of concern, a lot of world leaders who've spoken out about this.
Yeah, that's true. We've seen Joe Biden say that he absolutely positively wants Israel to stop targeting or stop being reckless in such a way as to be resulting in peacekeepers being shot at and killed, wounded and so forth. There are lots of European leaders saying the same thing. We've seen Macron make some very strong statements about it as well. So there's a great deal of concern about this. And the big fear, and it seems to be sort of materialising, is that parts of southern Lebanon, southern Beirut in particular, are starting to look like Gaza. That is, that there's a lot of bombing going on and, of course, a lot of collateral damage. And, we don't see much restraint being shown. None of these entreaties from world leaders seem to be having much effect on the Netanyahu government's approach.
Yeah, here were some of those comments about the UN peacekeepers.
Are you asking Israel to stop hitting UN peacekeepers?
Absolutely, positively.
We condemn it. We will not tolerate it and will not tolerate it happening again.
It is unacceptable. It violates what was established by Resolution 1701 of the United Nations.
It is absolutely reprehensible. It is unacceptable and serves as a reminder of the urgent need to end the violence.
And look, it hasn't all been one way. 2 aerial drones from Lebanon apparently entered Israel. One was intercepted, another caused some building damage near Tel Aviv. But James, there's no sign of de-escalation at the moment, is there? And we're still waiting for Israel to launch its retaliation against Iran. That's expected to come soon.
Yeah, look, exactly. I mean, asking Israel not to bomb the blue helmets or, attack the blue helmets who've been there for a couple of decades is not exactly an extraordinary step for international leaders to make you think that was a given, right? In terms of Iran, I mean, I think people, analysts who focus on the region are generally a bit surprised that that attack against Iran, that retaliation against Iran hasn't happened yet. I
think Yom Kippur has just finished, right? The holiday has just finished, and maybe it happens soon, but yeah.
Yeah, precisely.
It's really interesting to see that what Israel's saying about that is that it will be surgical or very precise, and it will be very surprising. So, I mean, we've seen some pretty surprising things happen, not the least of which was, pages blowing up and walkie-talkies and so forth that really was the precursor to this ground invasion and to this bombing.
And there's sort of thought to be 3 options primarily. One would be to hit Iranian air bases, basically, sort of more of a like-for-like attack. One would be to attack port infrastructure where oil is being exported from, which some analysts think is sort of the most likely option. And then the third option, which is literally the nuclear option, which is to go after Iran's facilities, which are sort of dotted around the country, pretty well dug in, at least in some cases, into mountains and what have you, would require serious bunker buster bombs. That's thought to be the least likely, although maybe Netanyahu's preferred option.
Well, Biden's made it clear he does not want them to do that, so look, we'll see. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, Carly, we see those attacks continue and efforts to get Australian citizens out. I think the last flight, the government is saying at least, the last evacuation flight out will be later today our time?
It's later today our time, and there were some concerns about these flights not being full, leaving Lebanon in the last week. I think 2,500 people it will be by the time this last flight leaves tonight.
That's a reasonable number.
It's a reasonable number in a week, and we have to remember these people are uprooting their lives. They have businesses, homes, families here. It's quite hard to get from the southern parts to the airport.
And some of the strikes have been near the airport too, haven't they?
That's right. So travelling to the airport is possibly a very risky operation for people. Some people just don't want to leave. So that flight will leave tonight. I think there's people saying goodbye to, grandparents in palliative care and things like that. I think there's the commentary around it could be seen as quite victim-blamey, saying, they're getting free flights, or we've been telling people not to go for the last year, from both sides of the opposition and the government, saying we've been telling people not to go. I think it's harder than it looks.
Yeah, these situations are often messier than they appear from far away. Look, in terms of the debate here during the week, Mark, this motion, as I said, normally with a motion in Parliament, it's basically just to recognise an anniversary of something terrible that's happened. That's usually something both sides can agree on. But is it that surprising they could not agree on this?
Well, you notice in that package that you started off the show with, that at one stage you had vision of the Speaker saying division required, and division required seems to be the political imperative around this issue. It's divisive all over the world, and here as well in Australia, where we see this major division between the two sides of politics.
So where did they come unstuck on? Because the two leaders, James, Dutton and Albanese, met, was it 2 or 3 times? Why couldn't they agree?
There are a couple of key points of difference, David. The first was that Peter Dutton asked Anthony Albanese for a motion that only addressed what had happened on October 7 to Israel. So to frame it like
just the Israeli victims.
Exactly. And then the PM put forward an idea or the proposal to have 2 motions. So one dealing with October 7, one addressing the need for peace in the Middle East, because he said, look, here's a compromise. The original motion from Albanese was that call for peace in the Middle East, de-escalation, a ceasefire would all be in that one motion. That, in Dutton's view, was not appropriate. October 7 should just be for dealing with Israel. That was the point of difference. But, I mean, disappointing. It's not a it's controversial inherently, but it's not a controversial, I would have thought, idea to mark that day.
So Peter Dutton doesn't want to balance 2 competing views at all, much like the referendum, where the no approach was just one that was going to work for him.
Staked a claim early. He goes hard. He says, this is what we stand for. We've seen that on EDZYQ as well. That, the High Court decision on indefinite detention, Carly, is spot on.
Yeah, but when you say not controversial, it's interesting. It's not controversial to call for peace either, particularly when most of the world's leaders, including our key allies, are doing just that, right? So the Australian government is not breaking away from the American position. I mean, yes, there's this whole statement that everyone keeps trotting out that Israel has a right to defend itself, but Albanese adds, but how it does so matters. I mean, this is a sort of a trope now almost, given what we know is going on in the Middle East. Yes, it's answering a question that's not being asked, right?
Yeah.
No one's challenging Israel's right to defend itself. It is how it goes about that, or whether it interprets that as an ability to potentially obliterate.
But it is difficult for leaders, in Australia and elsewhere to spell out how far they think Israel should go in responding. And I think, it's fair to say we have seen the Prime Minister fairly cautious in his language. He's sticking to they have a right to defend themselves. I mean, we had Richard Marles on the program last week saying, well, they also have a right to respond, but being too specific...
They have a right to defend themselves, and they have a responsibility to show restraint. They have a responsibility to international law. And that's really where, the argument happens as to, whether they've exceeded that position. I think most reasonable people would say that the killing of women and children in vast quantities strains those boundaries.
Well, Carly, what's your take? I mean, you're not here watching the parliamentary debate every day in Canberra. Do you think most Australians, how much of a priority is this issue for them, do you think?
I think the disagreement in Parliament on the motion reflects the divide in the community. There was an interesting Resolve poll showing nearly 60% of Australians are not keen or strongly oppose public protests on the conflicts in the Middle East. And I think you could look at that a few ways. Okay, people are very reluctant to take a side on this. This is one of the most difficult things to speak about at the moment. Or you could look at it like, okay, maybe this conflict is not important to Australians right now. I think a year into this war, perhaps Australians are learning more and more, and they're accepting that 2 things can be true at once and not taking sides, because people are okay to hold 2 narratives at the same time without judging one as true and one as false. I mean, when the PM tries to do that, the opposition will call it weak leadership.
Yeah, we see the pressure come from both sides.
But when the average punter does that, it's becoming a stance. People don't want to make a public their position
take a stand. Yeah.
I think Carly's spot on. I think the majority of Australians are sort of hiding under the blanket and the bed, saying, I don't know what to think about this, or I don't want to engage with this. More to the point, I'm struggling to pay my mortgage or my rent, to put food on the table, those sorts of things. And one of the sort of offshoots, I guess, David, of us having this debate, of Peter Dutton, I think primarily dragging us onto this ground, is that we're off what should be core business for the Albanese government, which is, steadily seeing it standing in the polls decline, which is They need to be saying, they should be saying to punters, if they want to get re-elected, we hear your concerns, and this is not a first-order concern, I think, and no disrespect intended to most Australians.
Yeah, but it's making it harder for the government to get that focus on cost of living and so on when it's constantly having to talk about this. All right, well, time to talk to the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, James Paterson. He says there's a gulf between the Albanese government and the Biden administration on Israel. But in his statement to mark the October 7 anniversary, the US President said he will not stop working to achieve a ceasefire deal in Gaza. And Vice President Kamala Harris says that call for de-escalation also applies to the situation in Lebanon.
We have got to reach a ceasefire, both as it relates to what's happening in Lebanon and, of course, Gaza. We are working around the clock in that regard. But we need these wars to end, and we've got to definitely de-escalate what is happening in the region. And
Senator Paterson, welcome to the program.
Good morning.
You've said there's a gulf between Australia and the US, but the President, the Vice President, as we heard there, they, along with Prime Minister Albanese, are calling for a ceasefire. You're not. Aren't you the one at odds with the US?
Well, David, it's not a remarkable thing that Australia could come to a different judgment from the United States. We are our own sovereign country. The problem here is that the Prime Minister doesn't have the courage of his own convictions. He's unwilling to say when he disagrees with the United States, and he clearly does disagree with the United States. I think he should just be open and honest about that and say this is where we disagree, but let me give you a couple of examples where that's clearly the case. When Hassan Nasrallah was killed a couple of weeks ago, President Biden welcomed that unambiguously. The Prime Minister has never done so. The United States is one of the most important suppliers of military equipment to Israel in this conflict. Our country, under Albanese, has put an effective ban on exports of military equipment to Israel, and the Foreign Minister has been trumpeting that. When Israel entered into southern Lebanon to degrade Hezbollah, spokesman for the State Department last week welcomed that. The Prime Minister's never done so. President Biden says on numerous occasions not only does Israel have a right to defend itself, but Israel has a right to respond. The Prime Minister has never brought himself to say the statement that Israel has a right to respond, despite being repeatedly asked in interviews and doorstops.
But on the issue of a ceasefire, just to be clear here, do you want to see a ceasefire?
Well, we ultimately want to see an end to this conflict, but David, in my view, that will only happen once Hamas releases the hostages and once Hamas is degraded so they no longer pose an ongoing threat to Israel from Gaza, and once the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701, which was passed in 2006 unanimously by the United Nations Security Council, restores that demilitarised status of southern Lebanon south of the Litani River. Until those things can be resolved, then I think there is going to be ongoing conflict, sadly.
So you are at odds with the US right now on a ceasefire?
Well, I think the Biden administration has been clear they welcome Israel degrading Hezbollah's capability in southern Lebanon.
On the need for a ceasefire.
Well, that can only happen when Hezbollah is degraded and defeated to such an extent that it doesn't pose a threat to Israel. Let's remember that in the last 12 months since October 7, 9,000 rockets have been launched by Hezbollah into northern Israel, and there are 65,000 Israelis who are displaced internally and cannot return to the north. Israel does not want a 7th of October happening on their northern border, and until that area south of the Litani River can be cleared of Hezbollah, I think it's going to continue, and I understand why Israel is taking the steps that it is.
Yeah, OK, and we'll get to that, but you said the Prime Minister should be clear where he disagrees with the US. Are you clear that you disagree with the US on a ceasefire at the moment?
Well, David, it wouldn't be remarkable for an Australian politician to disagree with an American politician, particularly the United States administration under President Biden and Vice President Harris is a centre-left administration. I'm from a centre-right political party. There will be times that we disagree, and mature adults can be open and honest about that. I think that's unremarkable.
This is our main ally. Are you saying it's no big deal to disagree with them on one of the biggest foreign policy issues right now?
Well, David, the United States, of course, is our main ally. They're our closest friend. I've been there 3 times in the last 12 months. I've had these conversations directly with members of the Biden administration, with potential future appointees to a Trump administration. Yes, from time to time, Australian politicians and US politicians will disagree on things, particularly questions of principle. We are very strong supporters of Israel. We understand the circumstances they face. God forbid Australia ever faces challenges that Israel faces. God forbid Australian politicians are ever faced with these choices. But if we are, I expect that the Australian public would expect their government to respond as decisively as Israel has.
OK, but should you stop having a crack at Anthony Albanese for having some gulf between his position and the US when you've got a clear difference with the US on a ceasefire?
Well, David, I'm just pointing out the differences that do occur between the Albanese government and the Biden administration. I think they're self-evident. I gave you 4 examples of them. It's the Prime Minister who's unwilling and unable to acknowledge that. It's the Prime Minister who's trying to say that they're on the same page when it's clearly not the case. He should have the courage of his convictions. He shouldn't be weak. He should be honest and stand up and say what he believes.
You've said you want to see Hamas degraded before any ceasefire. You've also said you support Israel doing what it needs to do to restore deterrence in the region and put Iran back in its box. What does that mean?
Well, Iran, and particularly the IRGC, is the puppet master behind the war on Israel. They own and operate effectively the 3 terrorist organisations attacking Israel right now, Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthis. And it is only because Iran has been emboldened in recent years that they feel not only can they use those proxies to attack Israel, but they can openly attack Israel. They have, on 2 occasions now, launched attacks on Israel using drones and missiles directly from their territory to Israel's territory. That is not a good thing, and it is completely understandable why Israel feels the need to reassert deterrence, and it's clear, by the way, that the Biden administration supports them in doing so.
Do you have concerns about some of Israel's actions, particularly the wounding of UN peacekeepers?
Certainly, if it is the case that it was IDF action that wounded UN peacekeepers, that is very unfortunate and that is very regrettable. It should be investigated. It should not happen.
When it comes to ceasefire, if you disagree with the Biden administration on this, do you also disagree with the G7 leaders generally, the British Prime Minister, the other G7 leaders who've also called for a ceasefire?
Well, let me give you a kind of tangible example here, David. It was on the 26th of September that Australia, with some other nations, called for a ceasefire in Lebanon. Had Israel followed that advice, Hassan Nasrallah would still be alive today, the former head of Hezbollah. Now, President Biden himself, as I said before, has publicly welcomed the death of Hassan Nasrallah. I agree. I think the world is a better place without Hassan Nasrallah in it.
The question's about ceasefire and whether you disagree, not just with Joe Biden, but with the other G7 leaders.
Well, of course, David, we ultimately aim to get to a ceasefire. Of course, we ultimately aim to get to peace. But I don't think that that's going to happen unless Israel can successfully remove the very serious and existential threat that it faces. I mean, some public assessments are out there saying that 50% of Hezbollah's rockets have been disabled, have been degraded and can no longer pose a threat to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and other populated centres. Again, the Biden administration has welcomed that, and so do I.
OK, but one day a ceasefire, but only, just to be clear, only when Hamas is degraded, Iran is back in its box. This could be a very long time.
Well, David, if those things don't happen, then we will just have other conflicts like this in the future. If Hamas is allowed to regain control of Gaza, as they have after previous conflicts, they have publicly said that they will launch more attacks like that they did on the 7th of October, which caused the largest loss of Jewish life in a single day since the Holocaust. That would be intolerable to any liberal democracy. Australia would not tolerate that threat, and I understand why Israel won't tolerate it either.
Let's turn to your criticism of the visas that have been granted to Palestinians here in Australia. You've called for the cancellation of a visa granted to Fayez al-Hassani because he has links to Hamas. He hosted Hamas representatives at an event 5 years ago in Gaza. Look, ASIO has looked at him. Look, they've not cancelled his visa. Has ASIO got this decision wrong?
Well, ASIO doesn't cancel visas, David. ASIO provides security assessments to the government on people's visas.
They've not recommended a cancellation by the looks of it.
Well, that's something that you might be aware of, but I'm not. That hasn't been publicly reported previously. Let's look at the test that Mike Burgess set out when he was speaking to your colleague Sarah Ferguson at 7:30. He said that anybody who had simply liked a tweet calling for the destruction of Israel or liked a tweet in support of Hamas constitutes a security threat to Australia that should not pass muster. Now let's look at what Fayez al-Hassani is reported to have done. Well, 3 of his brothers and 2 of his sons were members and key operatives in listed terrorist organisations. As you say, he hosted not just Hamas but Palestinian Islamic Jihad and others at a press conference at his institute, at which he said we must resist Israel by all means necessary. It's also been reported that last year in Iraq at a conference he said that his son was raised to wage jihad and that his grandson is being raised in the same way. His institute has published art which is anti-Semitic in nature and which glorifies terrorism. Now, in my view, that very easily clears the low bar for a cancellation on character grounds, even if it doesn't meet the bar of security grounds. But I think if we look at the Burgess test, which is publicly set out, it's hard to see how he meets that.
But you don't seriously think Mike Burgess has recommended his visa be cancelled and the government's ignoring that, do you?
Well, I don't know. What we do know, David, is that through an order of production of documents through the Senate that I secured a couple of weeks ago, that ASIO was referred 2,601 Gaza visa applicants on the 16th of March this year.
All of them, right?
That's an extraordinary number of visas to be referred in just one day, and they were referred after their visas were granted, not before they were granted. That puts ASIO in a very difficult position. Now, they're diligent, they're patriotic, they're hardworking, but Mike Burgess himself has said ASIO is not all-seeing and all-knowing, and we wouldn't want them to be all-seeing and all-knowing. That would be a security state, not a liberal democracy.
They might not have given enough scrutiny to El-Hassani.
Well, I don't know, David. All I can say, based on the public information that we have, is I don't think El-Hassani meets the test that Mike Burgess has set out.
Do you have,
but
this,
to be clear,
this leads
David,
to an important
David,
question. Do you have faith in ASIO's vetting of these Palestinians?
I have total faith in ASIO. I have total faith in Mike Burgess. My doubts are about Tony Burke and Anthony Albanese.
I can understand your political point there, but if ASIO have looked at all of these visas, as you say, they've looked at this guy, why isn't that enough?
Because, David, the Minister for Home Affairs and Immigration is the one who has the power to cancel visas. Courtesy of the Daily Telegraph on Wednesday, he is now apprised of these facts. Perhaps he wasn't earlier, but he is now. And he can cancel that visa not just on security grounds, but also character grounds. There are very wide provisions in the Migration Act which allow the Minister for Home Affairs and Immigration to cancel visas. I don't think this person meets the character test of the Migration Act. If Tony Burke disagrees with that, he should set out as to why.
There was another foreign national that made headlines during the week who addressed the October 7 rally in Western Sydney. Khalid Beydoun, a visiting US professor, he called October 7 a day of celebration. I understand that he has now left the country, left on Thursday after being told that his visa would be cancelled. Do you welcome that?
Well, since he became the Minister for Immigration and Home Affairs, as far as I'm aware, Tony Burke has not cancelled a single visa of any of these protesters, of any of these visitors to our country, despite them stoking hatred and division in our country. His talk's a very big game, but he doesn't actually follow through. It's all well and good that someone has voluntarily left our country.
After being told his visa was going to be cancelled.
Well, that's news to me, David. I don't understand why this visa wasn't just cancelled. Tony Burke said he requested a brief from his department. That should be one of the easiest briefs he has ever signed from his department, because this is a person who on the 7th of October at a rally at Lakemba Mosque said that it was a day of celebration. No one who says things like that should be welcome in our country. But by the way, David, I don't think he should have been granted a visa in the first place either, because a week before he came to Australia, he posted on social media, on Instagram, in support of Hassan Nasrallah. Now, how is someone who supports a dead terrorist being granted a visa to come to our country?
Let's turn to China. It's pledged to remove the remaining trade restrictions on Australian rock lobsters. It follows the removal of bans on coal and barley and wine and beef. Do you give the Albanese government any credit for stabilising relations with China?
Well, certainly, David, it is very welcome that these tariffs have now been lifted and this economic coercion campaign is coming to an end. And of course, it happened on the Albanese government's watch. They deserve some credit for that. But I actually think it is a credit to Australia as a whole, because the reason why the Chinese government has walked away from these sanctions is because they didn't work. They had two objectives. One was to damage the Australian economy and to send a message to our like-minded partners and friends: never speak out against China because there'll be a cost. And the second was to change our domestic public policy settings, which they made very clear in the list of 14 demands. It's failed on both counts. The Productivity Commission estimates it hit our economy by 0.1%. All of our allies and friends took the opposite message that China would hope. They're reducing their dependence on China rather than stopping to criticise them. And we have locked in behind those issues that China asked us to change. And that's a bipartisan achievement. It started on the Morrison government. It's continued on the Albanese government. Yes, they deserve some credit for that.
The coalition has flagged a tougher approach on China. For example, would you want to see Australia ban Chinese-made vehicles?
No, I haven't called for that, David, although I do want to look very closely at this issue, because connected vehicles, internet-connected vehicles, are a national security and a cyber security risk, so much so that the Biden administration is taking very tough action to eliminate them from the US market. If our closest friends and allies think it's a concern, then I think we need to address it in some way as well.
So you'd look at it, you'd consider a ban on Chinese vehicles?
It's not my preference to have a ban, David. I think there are other ways of mitigating these risks. We can impose, well, for example, you can impose minimum cybersecurity standards that would lift the bar that all internet of devices like that have to meet, not just cars, but other devices that are connected to the internet.
So just explain that to me. If they are cyber connected, they'd have to. Well, how could you actually protect against any sort of spying or data collection?
Sure, David. Well, there's a whole lot of minimum or mandatory cybersecurity standards that could be imposed on any internet-connected device, whether that is a security camera or a baby monitor or a car. And it is the basic kind of cyber mitigations. It's about the control of what happens to the data, who it's shared with, who it goes to, what it transmits. And you could set a high bar that everyone would have to meet if they're importing to Australia. I think that's something that we should be considering.
And look, a final one. Last time you were on the program, you said the Coalition would be seeking advice on TikTok and whether it could be banned in Australia. You're of course worried about its Chinese ownership. Have you received any advice on that?
David, I've had extensive discussions with our US counterparts on this, and I think the action that the United States Congress has taken here is something that we should look at emulating. The US Congress has passed a bill which requires TikTok United States to be divested from its parent company ByteDance, and the reason why that's important is that ByteDance is subject to the control of the Chinese Communist Party, particularly Article 7 of the 2017 intelligence law, which requires its employees to cooperate with Chinese intelligence agencies and keep it secret. Unless that link is severed, then I think TikTok is going to pose a national security risk, and particularly a foreign interference risk in our democracy. The US has taken this action. The worrying thing, David, is that you might end up with a safer version of TikTok in the United States and a more dangerous version of TikTok in Australia because we've been unwilling to take that action.
Senator James Paterson, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.
All right, well, let's get back to our panel for some thoughts on this. We're joined once again by Mark Kenny, James Massola and Carly Williams. Mark, just coming back to the point there on the ceasefire, and James Paterson is actually quite open about the fact that he is in disagreement with the centre-left President of the United States.
Yeah, I thought that was quite fascinating. I mean, we're so used to hearing the coalition talk about being as one with the United States, making a big issue if there is seen to be a crack of light between the government and our closest and most powerful ally. Suddenly it's fine, we're from one party, we're from one side of the political spectrum, they're from another. Obviously the fact that there's an election going on has loosened up things, I think, a bit. Talking about the election in the US in this case. But I thought it was quite fascinating that he was so open about that.
Yeah, what did you think, James?
A couple of thoughts. First, looking or thinking rather about James Paterson's background, a former staff member at the Institute of Public Affairs. Notwithstanding the seriousness of what some of these people who've been out here speaking at Lakemba Mosque and what have you, sort of saying it was October 7 a day for celebration, obviously that's not the case. But it sits a bit uncomfortably with me to hear someone like James Paterson, who's been a long champion of free speech, to be saying, let's shut down free speech. That didn't quite wash with me. And then to just roll back to the kind of bigger picture here. So the Coalition has been chasing Labor on this question of visitor visas granted to people coming from the Palestinian territories, from a war zone. Under the former government, I think it's important to remind people, about 9,500 people came from Iraq, Syria, the Palestinian territories and Afghanistan across about 9 years. So these are the same visas.
Including when ISIS was in.
Yeah, precisely. These are the same visas that are now, same cohorts of people that are now being granted visas by Labor. So I don't understand what the difference is if they were willing to do it in government.
Let's turn to The Voice. Tomorrow marks 12 months since the unsuccessful referendum. Australians overwhelmingly rejected putting the Indigenous voice in the Constitution. Carly, firstly, how will the anniversary tomorrow, how will it be marked?
I'm not aware of any official government.
A big event.
There's no government events, but there are community-led events. Our team was in Nowra in regional New South Wales yesterday for a community get-together. Auntie Pat Anderson spoke at that one. Our team has spoken to a range of key players. Our 30-minute program airs on ABC today. It's called Australia, What Do You Reckon? It's asking some pretty uncomfortable questions and just sort of testing the temperature as to where we are.
We've got a bit of that right here, and we've got a QR code so you can check out the full show. But here are some of the sentiments from from Indigenous Australians 12 months on from the referendum.
It was an opportunity to make some steps forward together, I suppose, but it looks like we took a couple steps back.
I think there was a lot of hurt leading up to the day of the referendum as well as the days afterwards. It's like it was a chapter and it's gone. Like, it happened. And the only thing that we can do now is move forward.
Did that reflect the general sentiment that you picked up?
How lovely to hear from Sienna Stubbs there. She's a young Yolngu woman, and she has given me a lot of hope about the future, actually. We spoke to Linda Burney as well, reflecting on her memories of this time last year. She admitted that she wanted to disappear. Lydia Thorpe said it became the country, deciding whether we deserved something, and that didn't feel right.
Lydia Thorpe proposed it though, didn't she?
Sorry, Lydia Thorpe, yeah. Of course, but she still said, look, it just felt like the whole country was, deciding whether we're worthy of something. It's interesting to hear her reflections because she was such a staunch no. We spoke to David Littleproud as well. We have non-Indigenous key players in the program. And Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, she's said something quite interesting, that Australia feels more divided now than it did pre-referendum.
I've got a bit there that I'm going to play in a moment as well. But I also caught up with Professor Megan Davis for our podcast this week. She, of course, was one of the architects of The Voice, very central to the idea, the Uluru Dialogue process and the referendum working group and all of that, and formulating the referendum question. And, obviously she talks about how difficult the past 12 months has been, this grieving of the last 12 months. We also talk about where to from here. But I was really interested in some comments she's made around whether they should have pulled it when it became pretty clear leading up to the vote that it was going to go down. And I found this fascinating as to whether she thought it should have actually been withdrawn. Have a look. Did you say that to him? Did you ever say to the PM, this is looking risky, this is going to hurt more than it's going to help, we should drop it?
I never had that kind of relationship with the Prime Minister, but I know that there are leaders deeply concerned about continuing on if it was that they had such definitive information that it was going to fail.
But was that your view, to be clear, before the referendum, that it shouldn't proceed?
I think it's hard to say now, but I certainly would have been up for that discussion.
We're all about the QR codes. You can get the full conversation there. But what do you make of that? She was open to pulling it. Mark, there was no public discussion of that from the yes side leading up to the vote, was there?
It's a bit hard to quantify, and there wasn't quantified because even she says she didn't say it to the PM and presumably not to too many other key decision makers in the process. So it's a bit hard to know exactly how to weigh that. I know I said it to a number of people in government. Well, I raised, like a journalist or any observer would, I asked the question, and I was always told that's impractical, that wouldn't work, that would be worse than proceeding and so forth. I think.
What do you think in hindsight? I know this.
In hindsight, I think that was a disaster. I think the whole thing was a disaster. I think it was a massive miscalculation. I think it's done enormous damage. I think it's put constitutional reform back by probably 20 years. I can't imagine the Labor Party stumping up with a constitutional reform proposition in the next decade, and probably two, maybe more than that. Now, you're not going to get it coming from the coalition side, I wouldn't have thought either. So for a lot of reasons, I think that is a significant setback. And it should have, when you think about it, a lot of these things were miscalculated. The simple fact is, if it didn't have bipartisan support, it wasn't going to get up, right? So that needed to be the first test. It needed to be the first thing that was achieved, some sort of model that both sides of politics could embrace. Then it would have a fighting chance of getting up with the Australian people. In the absence of that, and bear in mind that it was November of 2022 when Littleproud took his Nationals with Nampijinpa Price, pulled them out and said, no, we're voting no. Now, from that moment on, I would argue bipartisanship was dead. It was unthinkable, even though Dutton waited till April to declare the Liberal Party position. I don't think there was any real question about it. He couldn't have gone the other way. He would have suffered defections and questions about his leadership. So I think at that point, nearly a year before the vote, it could have been, a decision could have been taken, and there was cover for the government to do that on the basis of protecting the reform.
Right, to get to a certain point and then say, look, we're not going to proceed at the moment with this referendum. And look, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, you mentioned, she was very influential, of course, in delivering that no result.
Yeah.
I mean, she basically agrees that it's left us in a worse position.
I'd say we're much more divided as a nation than what we were prior to the referendum, and we've got a bit of work to do to bring ourselves together as a country.
So is this a widespread sentiment, or, I mean, Anthony Albanese would say, no, people wanted me to go ahead with it, we said we would, we went ahead with it, that's what we promised to do.
I think the PM said, well, we were doing what Indigenous leaders wanted us to do after the 2017 Uluru Convention. This is what elders want us to do, so we're going to go. And hearing from people like yourself, Mark, I feel like the government just didn't want to listen. In my family, we call that blocked up.
It became an article of faith, though. It became an article of faith. If you raised questions like that, you were sort of considered, it was synonymous with being opposed to the referendum, when in fact you might have been for the change and thinking this is the wrong way to go about it.
Anyway, very few Indigenous leaders at the time. Mick Gooda, I think, was one who spoke to us saying, hang on a sec. And from the point of view of the PM, from the government.
He copped it for saying that.
He sure did. But, it's like that we need to reword the question argument. We need more detail argument that was running at the time. How does the PM start a process designed to listen to Indigenous Australians and give them a voice, and the first thing he does is say, we're not going to have the referendum, or we're going to change it to a model that Indigenous Aussies don't like. Like, it was on
example.
There was a no-win situation.
Well, I don't completely agree with that. I mean, I think the point is that the Australian government is the Australian government. It owns this process. The PM's one of the longest-serving MPs in the Parliament. He would have known better than anybody the sort of electoral chances of this, and would have known what the building blocks of success needed to look like, and that needed to be broad cross-party support.
But there was a view in government. There was a strong view amongst some in the government that, politics has changed. Bipartisanship in a referendum doesn't matter so more. People aren't wedded to the major parties.
There was a view in government and it was wrong.
But there's also a view that it wasn't just the bipartisanship or the lack of bipartisanship. Professor Megan Davis says a lot of the misinformation was to blame for what happened. Anyway,
the country wasn't ready.
Those debates will continue. Clearly, there needed to be greater awareness of what this thing was before people, maybe it should have been legislated first. All of that can be debated.
The question was no good either.
Where to now, though? I mean, Mark obviously thinks we're a couple of decades away potentially from any sort of constitutional change. In the last 12 months, has it become clear at all where things go from here, Carly, do you think, or is it completely unclear?
Well, Lydia Thorpe told us 12 months on, she thinks there is zero leadership from government. She says that government is walking back on truth-telling and treaty. Minister for Indigenous Australians, Malarndirri McCarthy, told us the very next day we'll know the government is still committed to those outstanding Uluru Statement elements.
This is the Makarrata Commission, although the PM was
at a national level,
unclear
right?
on that back at Garma.
I can't, very much so, I can't see much progress on the truth-telling and treaty at the national level. States and territories, they're going on with their own processes. We've had the Uruk Commission in Victoria, and last month the Queensland Truth and Healing Inquiry started in Brisbane. I was in the room for that first week, and it was a powerful, worthwhile platform to sit there. It's set up like a court, and listen to elders tell their story. Like Uncle Brian Gray told me, he spent 12 years in a Rockhampton orphanage in the 60s and the 70s. He was beaten, there was sexual abuse at this place. He didn't know what the word mother was. He'd never had a birthday cake. He was lied to about his family. There's a whole generation of Australians who may not know these granular details and are willing to listen. And I think that truth-telling process is a worthwhile way forward because
does that mean the order was wrong? Because there were a lot of people who were arguing that the truth-telling needed to come first in order
Lydia Thorpe was one of them.
In order to kind of licence the then constitutional change, to give it some sort of oomph.
Back to the Uluru Convention in 2017, in the room, there was a disagreement about the sequence of reforms. Yes, voice, treaty, truth was what was agreed. Should it have been truth, treaty, voice?
It goes to the sort of bigger point someone made to me around the time of the defeat of the referendum, which was that the same-sex marriage plebiscite worked because most Australians, 60% or so, went, gay Australians are going to have the same rights as me, that's fair. Whereas there was a perception amongst some in the community with voice that, Indigenous Australians are going to have more rights than me, and that's unfair. There was a lack of education.
Well, that was the I think the most potent no campaign argument that cut through. Look, we need to move on because in the lead up to this anniversary, Fatima Payman, the former Labor, now Independent Senator, decided to announce her new party and decided to call it Australia's Voice. How did that go down?
Malarndirri McCarthy, Minister for Indigenous Australians, she said it was very questionable timing. From a PR perspective and a marketing perspective, the majority of the country said no to the Voice referendum. Why would you want to use this very well-known word?
Megan Davis in the podcast is a little more scathing than what you mentioned there from Maladira McCarthy. Look, I did catch up with Fatima Payman though, and asked her about naming it this and the backlash from the Indigenous leadership. She's making no apologies.
This isn't just the Voice referendum per se. This is Australia's voice, and that's encompassing all the communities, people from all walks of life.
You're adopting that name.
I mean, the voice in particular, the word voice isn't trademarked per se.
It's not trademarked.
If you're going to see it on the ballot paper and it says Australia's voice, I think there'll be plenty of voters who aren't, schooled up in all of these things, and they're going to look at it and just assume it's the old voice thing that.
What's she trying to do? Or the anti-Muslim party that was registered under that name back about 10 years ago.
That's right, yeah.
I mean, not to forget that either, a party that Glenn Drury helped set up. I think...
Who now works for Senator.
Who now works for her, indeed.
Bottom line, what are the prospects of this new party?
Not good.
I'd say the same as, the Rex Patrick party. I'd say the same as the Glenn Lazarus party. Jackie Lambie's success in Tasmania is an exception. Nick Xenophon in SA back in the day, a bit of an exception. I don't think we'll be hearing from Senator Fatima Payman again after the next...
Yeah, I would think it's ironic that Senator Payman, I remember sitting in this chair when you were doing the interview with her, a few days before she defected. She's, in many ways, she's a quite impressive person, but I think that the proposal she's going forward with now, I think it's highly unlikely to have any significance. She's, as I say, it's ironic that she is, worrying about the two-party duopoly and saying that is a main reason why Australians want change, when she's actually sitting in the Senate as a person elected by the two-party.
Through that machine.
Yeah, I mean, she wasn't elected for who she was. She was on the ticket at number 3 in what was supposed to be an unwinnable spot.
A few other things. The lobsters, mentioned it with the Senator a little earlier. The Prime Minister was at the ASEAN Summit in Laos and met the Chinese Premier, came away with the good news that China will be lifting the trade ban on lobsters by the end of the year. The Foreign Minister, the Trade Minister, they were pretty keen to celebrate this. And look, how else do you celebrate it than awkwardly holding... I mean, I'd be awkward too, I must admit, holding... the lobster doesn't look too comfortable there, but look, it's good news for those lobster growers who for years, the last few years, have had a really tough time. Yes, you can try to diversify into other markets, but there's nothing quite like the size of that China market, the price they're willing to pay for Australian lobsters. Is this the dividend of the stabilised relationship?
Yeah, look, very much so. This is the last major sort of export to China that had been sanctioned. It's worth about $800 million a year in exports out of a total of about $20 billion a year that was on hold for a couple of years. Don Farrell, Penny Wong, they're right to celebrate. The question for me, David, is how long does this sort of reset moment with China last? How long is it sustainable, given everything else that's going on in places like the South China Sea and Taiwan?
Well, maybe some of that depends on whether China thinks all of this worked over the last few years, this weaponisation of trade.
Yeah, and that's what James Paterson was saying. And I think there's some truth to what James Paterson was saying, that in the end China had kind of imposed these sanctions.
Australia didn't shift its position.
Australia didn't shift its position quite rightly, didn't yield to those 14 points and so forth. And I think there was a degree of unanimity in the Australian political community around that. But there's no doubt the change of government allowed for a reset of the relationship. And I think now, to be fair to people like Don Farrell, I think he has worked very hard in terms of establishing a personal relationship with, what's his name, Wing Wentan, the trade minister in China. They do have a quite good understanding, although I understand that none of those conversations occur without an interpreter, so I don't know how free those discussions are, but apparently...
Put in a lot of legwork.
And I think that puts some personal protections, at least. They won't be absolute in any way, but they may allow for dialogue to continue, because one of the big things we noticed when the freeze happened, of course, was that basically that ended all communication. So maybe the relationship's in a slightly more robust place to handle some of these other differences.
A couple of other quick ones. The culture of the parliamentary workplace or workplaces is again in the spotlight. This time it's in the office of Richard Marles, the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, to be clear, he's not accused of bullying himself, but his Chief of Staff, who's kind of been stood aside for months now, is saying others in the office were bullying her, and she wasn't happy when she went to Richard Marles with the fact that she was essentially shuffled out of the office. Not dismissed, but here she was.
So why speak now? Ultimately,
It was my daughter who convinced me to come forward. When I was in a completely broken state a few weeks ago, she said, "Mum, maybe if you told people the truth, maybe someone would help you."
Richard Marles said some of the claims are disputed. What's not in dispute, though, James, is that they haven't really been able to resolve this for months.
No, it's a mess. It's a bizarre...
in other duties for...
Indeed. So Jo Tarnowski, I may have mispronounced her name, worked for Richard Marles when Labor was last in government. She's come back. He regards her very highly, clearly, and then at some point, for some not really clear reason, they've just, he's decided, no, she needs to move out of the office. I think the bigger picture here, David, is what this shows, for me, is that post-Jenkins reforms, the review of parliamentary standards, what we've seen this week or the last couple of weeks with Dorinda Cox's office, 20 staffers leaving, the PWSS, which is the body that's supposed to manage these sort of workplace issues, none of it's quite working right yet. We've still got problems in Parliament House and there's still some ways to go.
And still, yeah.
But why is that? Is it's a toxic place to be? Is it because people are working 40 to 50 hours a week and they're tired and cranky, or is this a generational issue?
I think it's all of those things, but also all workplaces do have these issues. They play out very publicly, though, in that workplace. But
they're extremely strange workplaces, though. There's almost nothing that compares to a ministerial office, or indeed a busy MP's office, And the employment relationship is problematic.
Because the boss has ultimate power.
The boss has ultimate power, but is not, not actually personally the employer.
Yeah. The other one I need to show you is this moment where the PM clearly under pressure said something he should not have said.
Have you got Tourette's or something? You just sit there, babble, babble, babble.
Order.
I withdraw, Mr. Speaker. I withdraw.
Yeah.
I withdraw. I withdraw and apologise.
And he came back later for another apology. Clearly leaders say things they regret, but what did that reveal?
That reveals that the Prime Minister is 61 years old and not 21 years old. Look, I think he regretted that and he apologised more than once, and it was pretty sincere, but it's another opportunity to talk about why we don't use language like this anymore.
Making fun of a disability.
It's a slur.
Yeah, it's not great, is it, David? I think that shows a PM who's a bit rattled, a bit under pressure. Another parliamentary sitting week down, 3 to go for the year. Things probably haven't gone quite to plan for Labor. I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, I'd probably agree. I mean, he pretty quickly knew that he'd said the wrong thing.
So did the people sitting behind him.
Yeah, exactly. You see Anne Ali in particular there. Right. I think that the PM has a history of pretty sharp retorts. Anyone who's known him for a long time knows that he can be like that, and seen him operate like that in press conferences and in some direct conversations. But that was clearly a miscalculation. He also likes to be funny at the dispatch box from time to time at the opposition's expense. And I think that was the filter just didn't get that one before it came out.
Got through. All right.
Language is always evolving, right? So
yeah, good point. Yep. A reminder of that. Now, our panel, Carly Williams, James Massola, Mark Kenny, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with columnist for The Australian, Jack the Insider, and a very warm welcome. Jack, the troubles in the Middle East took centre stage this week, both inside and outside Parliament.
Lots of division this week.
Yeah. On Monday we had the anniversary of the Hamas attacks and Tony Abbott was at the pro-Israel rally at the front.
Tony Abbott led it there. I see Mike Kelly was there.
Yep. Bit of bipartisanship there.
Yes, indeed.
And then on the Tuesday, we had the pro-Palestinian rally. So there were varying press conferences. And Dr. Bushra Othman, who had served in Gaza, was a very heartfelt explanation of some of the things she saw there.
It's a Mike Bowers photograph. It's a very powerful photograph, Mike.
Of course, Lydia Thorpe was there. She was shouting at the
president,
who asked her to take a seat or leave, so she left.
It all worked out in the end.
And we saw the motion in Parliament that the opposition couldn't support because it involved
went through on
calling
Labor
for
numbers.
ceasefire. Yes, but it did go through on the numbers. really the photo of the fields goes to Ed Husick and Anne Ali.
They are not looking happy.
No. Johannes Leek, I think, has perfectly demonstrated the position of the government here, which doesn't look comfortable.
Lovely. It does not look comfortable and unsustainable, Mike, I would suggest.
Is it really so hard to reach across the aisle every once in a while, Mr. Dutton? Yes.
Yeah, no, great cartoon from Johannes.
David Rowe has got the good ship Australia, which is a bit barnacle-ridden by the look of it, sailing along with
barnacles there. Man overboard.
Ducks ahoy! Tony Abbott here seems to be rowing their particular craft.
The boat out.
Now this is just moral. David Pope.
Avert your eyes, young children.
The thought of Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, in a cheerleader's outfit is very disturbing.
It is very disturbing.
Moral clarity. We can't support a motion that suggests Palestinian lives also matter.
This is unacceptable.
Unacceptable behaviour. Kathy Wilcox has got the divisive dove of peace here.
Oh, yes. This is a very European cartoon. It's not necessarily funny. It's designed to make a point.
Yes. It must be a hard needle to thread for cartoonists, this conflict.
It's very divisive.
It's very divisive.
It's not an easy task at the best of times.
This week, Fatima Payman became the life of her own party, Australia's Voice.
Australia's Voice, yes. If you're third on the Western Australian Labor Senate ticket,
start your own party.
Go and start your own party.
Matt Golding's picked up on it beautifully. Australia's Voice with Fatima here at the microphone. Australia's Whisperer.
Whisperer's back.
Glenn Drury and Australia's Speechless, which is...
That's Elbow, not terribly happy.
And Glenn Drury attracts a lot of attention at these press conferences.
I smile for the camera too.
A lot of Australians are battling on the home front as the housing crisis does not seem to be easing. And Peter Brolman's picked up on the bank of mum and dad and the bank of grandma and grandpa.
Thank you for your home loan application. We'll pass it on to our assessment team. Mum and dad, and then off to granddad.
Granddad and grandma.
They're not letting a lot of things through.
David Pope has picked up on this beautifully with his references to the Breakfast Club. He's got Jacinta Allen and Chris Minns sitting with Max Chandler Mather and Adam Bandt.
Adam Bandt, yes.
Sir, do Labor premiers really have to share detention with the genuinely naughty kids?
Very naughty boys.
Yeah. Finally, Australians have lost some faith in the Parliament, but they gained some trust. As former British Prime Minister Liz Truss came and sat in on Parliament. Tom Red tweeted, "Can regular folk meet Liz Truss while she's here in Australia, or do you need special letters of introduction?"
Oh, boom tish.
Boom tish.
Yeah.
Jack, it's been a great pleasure unpicking events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
It's back to you, Spearsy.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Mike. Time for some final observations. Very quick one from me. Question time on Wednesday was shifted from 2 p.m. to 10 a.m. so the PM could go to ASEAN. Make it 10 a.m. every day. Better for all concerned, particularly the journos.
Good idea.
Final observations. I want to acknowledge the 1-year anniversary of the Voice referendum. It failed, but it did hurt a lot of people. There might be people at home going, wow, it's been 12 months already. I've forgotten all about that. That's fair too. But First Nations people, we haven't forgotten about it.
Oh, good point, James.
There is dismay in sections of the Greens at the moment about Adam Bandt's handling of the allegations that have been levelled against Dorinda Cox, and also questions still to be answered by Mr Bandt about what his office knew and when, and there'll be more to come on that.
Interesting. Mark.
Speaking of interesting, it's interesting that the government has initiated this inquiry into nuclear energy, a parliamentary inquiry, and it will probably report sometime before the election. We don't know when the election will be, but I think it reflects that Labor wants to get some political capital out of Dutton's policy for nuclear reactors. But I also think it suggests that Labor is slightly concerned that the population isn't as ideologically opposed to nuclear as many in the Labor Party and the Greens might think they are, and so a case needs to be made that this is going to be expensive and disruptive and take a long time and all those other arguments, and they want to get them out there.
And I suspect they'll hold hearings for that inquiry in the locations where the nuclear power plants are planned to go. Anyway,
exactly.
Good point. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Thank you to you as well. Finally, if the Queensland election campaign's any guide, it might be time to cancel your social media accounts, unless, of course, you're a fan of, well, whatever this is. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Nothing says grand final night like a beef, brisket and beer pie.
There's nothing like it, not like the way you move.
Pineapple belongs on a pizza. No, Thomas, pineapple is a fruit.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.